The train's whistle was a scream in the frozen air. It was the sound of a wounded animal, and it bounced off the snowy hills before dying out completely. Winter had this valley in a chokehold. Snow was everywhere, swallowing fences, burying roads, making the whole world quiet and dead. The only sign of life was the smoke bleeding from the chimneys in the little town down the track. Every breath you took turned into a ghost right in front of your face. Every face on the train platform looked like it was carved from ice. Lillian Hart pulled her thin shawl tighter. It was already damp from the snow. Her little boy, Thomas, leaned against her, shivering. He was clutching a worn-out wooden horse, its paint all rubbed off. His lips were pale, but his eyes were sharp, darting from the station clock to the strangers on the platform, and then back to his mother. He didn't say a word. He never did around new people. She knew what he was scared of. It was the same thing that was tying her own stomach in knots. They were waiting for a man who had promised her a new life in his letters, a man she had never met, and she was terrified that he would take one look at her, see her little boy, and turn his back on them both. She was terrified that all her hopes, all the words she'd carefully written by lamplight while Thomas slept, would just vanish like smoke in the cold. All her plans would turn to dust. The train groaned to a stop, its steel wheels shrieking. Steam hissed and fogged up the air. Doors banged open. People started pouring out, men in heavy coats, women in bonnets, children running into the arms of their families. The wooden platform thundered with boots. Voices mixed together, shouts and greetings and laughter. Lillian felt herself shrink, her heart pounding in her throat. She scanned the crowd, her eyes wide, searching for the man from the letters. The letters had described a man as tall as a pine tree, with shoulders as wide as a barn door. A man of few words, but strong promises. "I have need of a wife," he had written. "I am no man of words, but I keep my promises. If you can endure the winters, and you know how to work, you may find a place with me." He had signed it simply, Jedediah McGraw. But as the crowd thinned, she couldn't see anyone who looked like that. A cold spike of doubt hit her chest. Maybe he hadn't come. Maybe he'd found out about her son and decided to just stay away. She thought about the coins she'd saved, the long journey, the hope that felt so thin it might snap. The ache in her throat was so strong she could barely swallow. And then she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the platform, away from everyone else. He was even bigger than she'd imagined, a giant of a man in a long, dark coat. Snowflakes clung to the rough wool like frost. His hair was dark with streaks of gray, and a thick beard covered a face that looked like it had been carved from rock. His eyes were the color of a storm, and they were fixed right on her. He didn't look away. For a single, heart-stopping moment, his gaze was only on her. Then, his eyes dropped. They moved from her face down to the small boy clutching her hand. Lillian went rigid. It felt like a physical blow. Around them, the few townspeople who were left started whispering. Their voices were sharp. "She brought a boy. Didn't tell him, I reckon. McGraw won't stand for that." The words were like wasps, stinging her, but she forced herself to stand perfectly still. Thomas felt her fear and pressed closer, his tiny frozen fingers wrapping around hers. Jedediah McGraw didn't move. His face was a mask. You couldn't read a single thing on it. The silence stretched on, so thick it felt like the whole world was holding its breath, just waiting to see what this giant would do. Then slowly, he started walking toward them. The wooden planks of the platform groaned under his heavy boots. He didn't look at the whispering townspeople. He didn't look at anyone but her and the boy. He stopped right in front of Thomas, so tall he blocked out the light from the station lamps. He just looked down at the boy, at his pale cheeks, his defiant little stare, and the toy horse clutched in his hand. Then Jedediah did something no one expected. He crouched down. his huge frame folded until he was eye level with the child. His voice, when it came, was deep and quiet, and surprisingly gentle. "I need a child like this," he said, and his big, rough hand came to rest on Thomas's shoulder. His stormy eyes flicked up to meet Lillian's. "And I need a wife like you." The words hit her so hard she almost stumbled. It wasn't pain, it was relief, so sudden and powerful it made her dizzy. She gasped for air she didn't realize she'd been holding. She wanted to thank him, but no words would come out. Thomas just stared at the giant, his little brow furrowed. Then, slowly, he gave a single, solemn nod. Behind them, the whispering stopped. Jedediah stood up to his full, towering height. He gave her a short nod, then reached down and lifted their bags like they were filled with feathers. Lillian followed him, her body still trembling, feeling the stares of the townspeople on her back. But for the first time, she didn't care. She just watched Jedediah's broad shoulders as he led them away from the station. He helped them into a waiting sleigh. He lifted Thomas in first, then offered Lillian his hand. His palm was calloused and warm. As he pulled her up, the world seemed to shrink until it was just the three of them, surrounded by the silent, falling snow. Jedediah took the reins, and the sleigh slid forward into the white landscape. Hope was a dangerous, fluttering thing in her chest. But as the sleigh carried them deeper into the valley, away from the lights of the town, a shadow of doubt crept back in. He had accepted them, yes, but his face was still a mask. His silence was a wall. She didn't know what kind of man he really was, what ghosts he might be hiding in that big, quiet house. A wolf howled somewhere in the distance, a long, lonely sound. Lillian pulled her son closer, her eyes fixed on Jedediah's dark shape against the snow. She had a sudden, chilling feeling that this wasn't the end of her trials. It was just the beginning. The sleigh cut through a world of white and gray. The only sounds were the hiss of the runners on the snow and the jingle of the harness bells. It felt like they were the only people left on Earth. Lillian watched Jedediah's back, trying to understand the man who now held their entire future in his rough, steady hands. He had accepted her son, in public, but the whispers from the platform still echoed in her ears. A widow and a child. He'll send them back. The journey seemed to take forever. When they finally saw the ranch, it was just a dark shape against the snow. A big log house with a barn looming behind it like a sleeping giant. Smoke curled from the chimney, but there were no other lights for miles around. This place wasn't just remote, it was isolated, as in completely cut off from the world. A perfect place to build a life, or a perfect place to hide a secret. Jedediah lifted Thomas down from the sleigh. The boy stared at the massive barn with wide, curious eyes. Then Jedediah carried their bags inside, moving with a silent purpose that was both comforting and deeply unsettling. The house was simple. A fire glowed in the hearth. A single lantern cast long shadows into the corners. It smelled of pine and wood smoke, and something else she couldn't quite place. Something old and sad. That night, Lillian lay awake on a narrow cot, listening to the wind howl outside. She wondered if she'd found a sanctuary or a prison. She still didn't know. The next morning, they rode back into town for Sunday service. Lillian hoped it would be a new start, a way to show the community they belonged. She was wrong. As they walked into the churchyard, conversation stopped. Heads turned. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. The preacher's wife, a woman named Ruthie McCoy, leaned over to her friend and whispered, just loud enough for Lillian to hear, "She came with a child. Imagine the deceit." The other women giggled behind their gloved hands, their eyes like little chips of ice. Lillian's face burned. She wanted to run. But Jedediah didn't even slow down. He walked right through the crowd, like they were invisible, his shoulders back, his face hard as granite. The whispers followed them all the way down the aisle and haunted them through the entire service. After the sermon, while Jed was fetching supplies, the women closed in on her. Ruthie McCoy was the first to speak. Her smile was thin and sharp. "We wish you well, Mrs. McGraw," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Though some of us do wonder about your honesty. Men can be so easily fooled." Lillian's stomach twisted. "I never hid my son," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "He is my truth." Ruthie leaned in closer. "Pray your husband continues to see it that way." When Jed returned, the women scattered. He didn't say a word, but he gave Ruthie a look so sharp it could have cut glass. The ride back to the ranch was silent. Lillian finally broke it. "They don't approve of me." Jed stared straight ahead. "They never have of me, either." And that was it. No comfort, no explanation, just a cold, hard fact. She looked at his rugged profile and wondered for the first time what secrets this town held about him. What had he done to earn their scorn? But the wall of his silence was too high to climb. She was too afraid to ask. The weeks crawled by. The whispers in town grew into open hostility. The other children at the small schoolhouse taunted Thomas, calling him fatherless. One day Lillian found him with a bloody lip, his eyes blazing with fury. She took him home, her heart breaking. But that evening, Jed did something strange. He didn't comfort the boy. He took him out to the barn. Lillian watched from the doorway as the giant of a man stood in front of her small son. He wasn't teaching him to ride a pony or mend a fence. He was teaching him how to throw a punch. His voice was low and steady. He showed Thomas how to stand, how to make a fist, how to aim for the chin. There was a coldness in Jed's eyes she had never seen before. It wasn't kindness. It was something harder, something dangerous. She watched them for a few minutes, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. This wasn't just about self-defense. This was about survival. Later that night, as snow began to fall again, she found Jed standing on the porch, staring out into the darkness. She had to know. "Why are they so cruel?" she asked, her voice small. "To you? To us?" He didn't turn around. "This valley has a long memory," he said. His voice was flat, "and it doesn't forgive." "Forgive what?" she pressed. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the wind whistling through the eaves. When he finally spoke, his words chilled her to the bone. "They think I killed my family." Lillian froze, the blood draining from her face. She couldn't breathe. He had told her they died of sickness. A lie. What else had he lied about? She looked at the massive dark shape of the man beside her, the man who had shown her son how to fight, the man the entire town seemed to hate. A terrible question bloomed in her mind, cold and sharp. Had she brought her son here to find a new father, or had she just delivered him into the hands of a monster? She stared at his back, at the rigid line of his shoulders, and she saw him not as a savior, but as a cage, and the door had just slammed shut. He turned his head then, his storm-colored eyes finding hers in the dim light. "I didn't," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But the truth doesn't matter much in a place like this." He looked away again, back into the swirling snow. "Out here, stories are stronger than facts, and their story is that I have a darkness in me." He paused, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "Some days, I think they might be right." Her mind was reeling. A murderer? It couldn't be. But the town's hatred, his silence, the way he taught her son to fight with a cold precision. It all started to click into a terrifying new picture. She had been so focused on whether he would accept them, she never stopped to ask if she should accept him. The next day, she found it. While Jed was out checking his traps, she let her fear guide her. She walked the property, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. Behind the barn, half hidden by a snow-covered thicket of pine, were two small, rough-hewn crosses stuck in the frozen ground. They weren't in a proper graveyard. They were just there. One was larger, the other heartbreakingly small. His wife and son, buried right here on the ranch, not in the churchyard with the rest of the town. Why? Was he hiding them? Or was he keeping them close? She felt like she was going to be sick. She ran back to the house, her heart pounding. She had to know the truth. Not his version, not the town's. The real story. And she had a feeling the answer was somewhere inside this silent, lonely house. She started in the main room, her hands shaking as she looked through the few belongings he had. A box of worn letters from his parents, long dead. A collection of tools. Nothing. Then she saw the chest at the foot of his bed. It was locked. Old, heavy iron. She tried to pry it open, but it was solid. Frantic, she looked around the room, her eyes landing on the fireplace poker. With a grunt, she wedged it into the seam and pushed with all her might. The old wood groaned, splintered, and then the lock snapped. Her breath caught in her throat. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, on top of a folded blanket, lay a child's worn leather boot. It was tiny. And beneath it, a sheriff's badge, tarnished and old, and under the badge was a folded piece of paper, a coroner's report. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. The ink was faded. She scanned the official words, her eyes searching for the cause of death. It wasn't sickness. The report for his son, Daniel McGraw, listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. For his wife, Sarah McGraw, it was even worse. Gunshot wound. The ruling for both? Accidental. Accidental. A fall and an accidental gunshot. At the same time? It made no sense. It was a lie. A cover-up. She slammed the chest shut, her mind screaming. Jed had been the only other person here. He had to have been involved. The town wasn't just gossiping. They knew something. They knew he was a liar. And a killer. Thomas came running in then, his cheeks red from the cold. "Mama, what's wrong?" She looked at her son, her innocent, trusting son, and a wave of pure terror washed over her. She had to get him out of here. Now. Before it was too late. She started grabbing their things, stuffing them frantically into their bags. "We're leaving, Thomas. We're going back." "But I like it here," he said, his little voice confused. "I like Jed." "Jed is not who you think he is," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He's a dangerous man." Just then, the front door swung open. Jed stood there, his massive frame filling the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. He took in the scene in an instant. The open bags, the broken chest, the terror on her face. His own face hardened, the gentle giant vanishing completely, replaced by something cold and unreadable. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Lillian stood frozen, her escape plan shattering around her. The house suddenly felt like a trap, the valley a prison, and the man in front of her was the warden. She had stumbled onto his secret, and she knew with a certainty that chilled her to her soul that he wasn't going to let them leave. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The heavy thud echoed in the silence like a coffin lid closing. He wasn't just a quiet man anymore. He was a threat. And they were utterly, terrifyingly alone with him. "You went through my things," Jed said. It wasn't a question. His gray eyes were flat, hard chips of stone. He took a step closer, and Lillian flinched, pulling Thomas behind her skirt. The fear in the room was so thick you could taste it. "I saw the graves," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "And the report, it wasn't sickness. You lied to me." "I told you what you needed to hear," he said, his voice still low, but with an edge like a razor. "The truth is complicated." "Complicated," she cried, her fear giving way to a surge of anger. "Your wife was shot. Your son fell. How is that complicated? The town thinks you're a murderer. And now so do I." He stopped, the accusation hanging in the air between them. For a long moment, he just stared at her, his expression unreadable. She expected him to deny it, to shout, to do something. Instead, he just looked tired. A deep, bone-weary sadness settled over his features. "My son was climbing the old windmill," he said, his voice rough with a pain that was years old but still raw. "A rotten rung broke. I tried to catch him, but I was too late." He swallowed hard, his gaze distant. Sarah saw it happen. She broke. She ran inside, and before I could get to her, she picked up my hunting rifle. She blamed me. Maybe she was right. He looked at Lillian then, his eyes pleading for her to understand. It went off before I could take it from her. The sheriff, a good man, he knew Sarah wasn't in her right mind. He ruled it an accident to protect her name, to protect me from a town that was already looking for a reason to hate me. Lillian stared at him, the story so horrible, so tragic, it couldn't possibly be real. But the raw grief on his face, the tremor in his voice, it felt true. Her anger began to dissolve, replaced by a wave of confusion and a terrible, aching pity. Could it be possible? Was his silence not guilt, but a grief so profound he couldn't speak of it? Before she could process any of it, the sky outside began to darken. A low moan started in the distance, the sound of the wind picking up speed. Jed glanced out the window, his face grim. Blizzard's coming, a bad one. The storm hit them like a fist. The wind howled and screamed, throwing snow against the window so hard it sounded like handfuls of sand. The little log house groaned under the assault. Within hours, they were buried, the world outside completely erased by a roaring wall of white. They were trapped. Not just by the snow, but by the terrible story that now lay open between them. That night, Thomas started coughing. At first, it was just a small, dry hack. But it quickly grew worse, a deep, rattling sound that shook his small frame. Lillian pressed her hand to his forehead. He was burning up. The fever came on fast and hard. He grew delirious, tossing and turning, murmuring names she didn't know. She tried everything, cool cloths, sips of water, but nothing worked. The fever just kept climbing. She looked at Jed, her eyes wide with panic. "We need a doctor. We need medicine." Jed's jaw was set like iron. "The town is a day's ride in good weather. In this, it's impossible." "We can't just let him die," she shrieked, her control finally snapping. Jed looked at the sick boy, then back at her. A flicker of that same raw pain she'd seen earlier crossed his face. He stood up and pulled on his heavy coat. "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "You can't. You'll be killed in that storm. You'll freeze to death before you get a mile." He gently removed her hand. His gaze was steady, and in his eyes she saw not a killer, but a man who had already lost one son and would be damned if he lost another. "If I stay," he said simply, "he dies. If I go, maybe he lives." And then he was gone, out the door and into the roaring white abyss. The hours that followed were the longest of Lillian's life. She held Thomas, rocking him, whispering to him, feeling his life fade with every ragged breath. The wind tore at the house, a constant, terrifying reminder of the man who was out there fighting it. Was he a monster? A liar? Or was he a hero, risking his life for a boy who wasn't even his? She didn't know. All she knew was that her son was dying. Just when she had given up all hope, when Thomas's breathing had become terrifyingly shallow, the door burst open. A figure, more snow than man, collapsed onto the floor. It was Jed. He was caked in ice, his lips blue, his face raw from the wind. He could barely move, but clutched in his frozen hand was a small, wax paper parcel. The medicine. He had made it. He had actually made it. She dragged him toward the fire, her mind reeling with a mix of terror and overwhelming gratitude. She managed to get a dose of the medicine down Thomas's throat, then turned her attention to Jed, stripping off his frozen coat, wrapping him in every blanket she could find. He was shaking violently, his breathing a harsh gasp. "You came back," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. His eyes, glazed with exhaustion, found hers. He managed a single, cracked word. "Always." Something inside her broke then. All the fear, the suspicion, the walls she had built up, they all came crashing down. This man, whatever his past, whatever his secrets, had just walked through hell for her son. Without thinking, she leaned down and pressed her lips to his. It wasn't a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of desperation, of survival, of a shared, terrible ordeal. His frozen hand came up and rested on her shoulder, his touch weak but firm. In the days that followed, the blizzard broke, and so did Thomas's fever. The world outside was silent and white, and inside the small cabin, a new, fragile quiet settled between them. The truth of Jed's past was still there, a ghost in the corner of the room, but it was overshadowed by what he had just done. He had proven himself not with words, but with an act of impossible courage. But the town hadn't forgotten its story. When the snows cleared enough for travel, the sheriff showed up at their door. It wasn't the old, kind sheriff from Jed's story. This was a new one, a hard-faced man with suspicious eyes. His name was McCoy, Ruthie McCoy's husband. "Heard you made a trip to town during the storm, McGraw," McCoy said, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "Doc tells me his medicine cabinet was broken into. Anything you know about that?" Lillian's blood ran cold. Jed hadn't just fought the storm. He'd had to fight the town, too. He had broken in to save her son. Jed stood tall, his face impassive. "I did what I had to do." "That's called theft, McGraw," the sheriff sneered. "And breaking and entering. Looks like the town was right about you all along. You do have a darkness in you." He looked from Jed to Lillian, a cruel smirk on his face. "And now you've dragged this poor woman into it." He pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "You're under arrest." Lillian gasped. This couldn't be happening. After everything they had been through, it was all going to be torn apart by a lie. A lie the town wanted to believe. As Sheriff McCoy reached for Jed, Thomas, now fully recovered, did something unexpected. He ran forward and stood between the two men, his small body trembling, but his face set with fierce determination. "You leave him alone!" he shouted, his voice ringing with a strength Lillian had never heard before. "He's not a bad man. He's my father." Everyone froze. The word hung in the air. Father. It was a claim, a truth spoken by a child that was more powerful than any lie. Sheriff McCoy hesitated, his smirk faltering for just a second. He looked at the boy, then at the giant standing behind him, and then at the woman whose face was a mask of fierce protection. He saw not a killer and his hostages, but something else entirely, something he hadn't expected. He saw a family. And for the first time, he seemed to wonder if the story the town had been telling for all these years might have been wrong. But the doubt lasted only a moment. His eyes hardened again. "That's a nice sentiment, kid, but it doesn't change the law." He snapped the handcuffs onto Jed's wrists. "He's coming with me." As they led Jed away, he looked back at Lillian, his face a mixture of regret and resolve. "It's not over," he said, his voice low but clear. "Fight for the truth." The words echoed in her mind as she watched him disappear down the snowy track, the sheriff leading him toward a town that had already decided he was guilty. She looked at her son, who was crying silently. She thought about the whispers, the lies, the unmarked graves, and the impossible blizzard. The town wanted a monster. They had spent years creating one in their minds, but she knew the truth now. Jedediah McGraw wasn't the monster. The monster was the story itself. And just as he had fought a blizzard for her son, She would now fight a town for him. She took Thomas's hand, her knuckles white. "He's right," she said, her voice hard as the frozen ground beneath her feet. "It's not over." Lillian knew she couldn't fight the town's hatred with anger. She had to fight it with facts, but the only facts she had were locked away in Jed's tragic story, a story no one but her had ever heard. The town had their own version, cemented over years of gossip and fear, and Ruthie McCoy was its chief architect. Lillian had to find a crack in that foundation. She had to find proof. She started back at the beginning, the windmill. The old structure stood at the far edge of the property, a skeletal ruin against the winter sky. It was dilapidated, dangerous, exactly the kind of place a curious little boy might want to climb. She walked the perimeter, her eyes scanning the frozen ground, not even sure what she was looking for. A clue? A sign? Something that would prove Jed's story after all these years? It was a fool's errand. Anything left from that day would be long gone, buried under seasons of snow and soil. Still, she searched. As she circled the base of the windmill for the third time, her boot caught on something hard under the snow. She knelt, digging with her bare, frozen fingers. It was a piece of rotten wood, a broken rung just like Jed had said. But that proved nothing. Then her fingers brushed against something else, something small and metal. She pulled it out. It was a small tin soldier, the paint almost completely worn away. It wasn't the kind of toy she imagined Jed's son playing with. It was finer, more detailed, something a wealthier family might own. She stared at it, a strange feeling prickling at the back of her neck. Where had she seen a toy like this before? Then it hit her. At the church service. Ruthie McCoy's own son, a boy a few years older than Thomas, had been clutching a whole set of them, lining them up on the pew beside him. Her heart started to pound. It was a wild, impossible thought. But what if Jed's son wasn't alone that day? She ran back to the house, the tin soldier clutched in her hand. She had to talk to someone, but who would listen? The whole town was against them. Then she remembered the one person who hadn't joined in the whispers, the one person who had looked at her with pity instead of scorn. The old doctor. The same one whose office Jed had broken into. He was a man of medicine, a man of facts. Maybe, just maybe, he would listen. She bundled Thomas up, hitched the horse to the sleigh, and raced toward town. She found the doctor in his office, a small, weary man with kind eyes. She laid the tin soldier on his desk. "This was at the base of the McGraw windmill," she said, her voice shaking. "I think another boy was there the day Jed's son died. I think it was Sheriff McCoy's son." The doctor stared at the toy, his face paling. He slowly sat down, looking older than he had just a moment before. "Ruthie's boy, Samuel," he breathed. "He had a terrible accident around the same time. Fell out of a tree, she said. Broke his arm badly. He never spoke a word about it, just screamed if anyone got near him for months afterward." Lillian's blood ran cold. It was all starting to make a horrible kind of sense. Ruthie's fierce, relentless hatred of Jed wasn't just town gossip. It was personal. It was a cover-up. "She's been lying," Lillian said, her voice a whisper. "Her son was there. He must have seen what happened, or—" She didn't dare say the next words aloud. What if the boys were playing? What if one pushed the other? What if Daniel McGraw's fall wasn't an accident at all? The doctor looked at her, his eyes filled with a dawning horror. "If what you're suggesting is true, then Jedediah McGraw has been carrying the blame for something he didn't do, and Ruthie McCoy has let him." At that moment, the door to the office flew open. It was Ruthie herself, her face a mask of fury. "I saw your sleigh," she hissed, her eyes locking on Lillian. "Spreading your poison, you homewrecker? Trying to turn people against us?" Her gaze fell to the tin soldier on the desk, and for a split second, her mask slipped. Lillian saw it, a flash of pure, undiluted panic. "Your son was there, wasn't he?" Lillian said, her voice steady and clear. "He was at the windmill with Daniel." "You lie!" Ruthie shrieked, but her voice was too high, too shrill. The doctor stood up. "Ruthie, tell the truth. What happened that day?" Just then, Sheriff McCoy stormed in, drawn by the shouting. "What's going on here?" he demanded. He saw the soldier, saw his wife's panicked face, and his own expression hardened. "Get out of here, Mrs. McGraw. Stop harassing my wife." "She's not harassing me," a small voice said from the doorway. Everyone turned. It was Samuel, Ruthie's son, now a lanky teenager. He was pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with a fear that looked years old. "Samuel, go home," Ruthie ordered, her voice cracking. But the boy shook his head. He looked at Lillian, at the doctor, at his parents. He looked like a dam that was finally about to break. "I was there," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "We were climbing. I dared him to go higher. The rung, it snapped. He fell." The confession came out in a torrent of sobs. "I didn't push him. I tried to grab him, but he just fell." The room was utterly silent, save for the boy's ragged sobs. "My son told me the boy fell on his own," Ruthie said, her voice trembling as she desperately tried to hold her story together. "He said McGraw came out of the barn shouting that he was angry, that he might have even pushed his own wife in his rage. My boy was terrified of him." "That's not what happened," Samuel cried, looking at his mother with betrayal in his eyes. "That's the story you told me to tell. You said if I told the truth, Mr. McGraw would hurt me. You said he was a monster." The truth was out. Ugly and raw and undeniable. Ruthie McCoy hadn't just allowed the town to believe a lie. She had created it. Terrified that her own son would be blamed for the accident, she had painted Jedediah as a monster to protect herself, feeding the town's suspicion, twisting their grief into hatred, letting an innocent man live in a prison of her making for years. Sheriff McCoy stared at his wife, his face collapsing in shame and disbelief. The entire foundation of his world, of the town's world, had just been demolished by a child's confession and a small tin soldier. Lillian didn't wait. She ran to the jailhouse. She found Jed sitting in his cell, staring at the stone wall, his face grim. When he saw her, he stood up. "It's over, Jed," she said, tears of relief streaming down her face. "The truth is out. Everyone knows." They released him moments later. As Jed stepped out into the daylight, the townspeople who had gathered in the street looked at him differently. The hatred and fear in their eyes were gone, replaced by shame and a dawning respect. He wasn't the monster from their stories. He was the man who had suffered in silence, the man who had carried their blame without a word. He didn't look at them. He only looked at Lillian. He walked toward her, and for the first time, she saw the walls around him crumble completely. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, his face buried in her hair. Thomas ran to them, wrapping his small arms around Jed's legs. That evening, they rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars. The silence in the sleigh was different now. It wasn't heavy with secrets and fear. It was peaceful. As the lights of their home flickered into view, Lillian leaned her head against Jed's strong shoulder. "You gave us a name," she whispered, remembering the night of the town feast. "And today, we gave you back yours." Jed looked down at her, a small, true smile finally reaching his eyes. "Family is not born," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It's forged, in winter, in storms." He took her hand, his rough fingers lacing through hers. "And we, Lillian, were forged in fire." They had found more than just shelter in that lonely valley. They had found the truth. They had found justice. And looking at the giant of a man beside her and the small boy nestled between them, Lillian knew, with a certainty that warmed her to her very soul, that they had finally, truly, found their way home. This story is a powerful reminder that the truth is always worth fighting for, and that a family is built on love and courage, not blood. If you were moved by their journey, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more incredible stories you won't find anywhere else.